Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I want to thank ICMA and Martin for the introduction and for inviting me here to speak to all of you today at the annual general meeting and conference in Stockholm. I'm delighted to address such a big and distinguished audience, and what I'm very pleased to see is that the regulatory view is still drawing the audience, so I will try to live up to that. And certainly what is clear is that the European securities markets are undergoing an unprecedented transition linked to various factors, and obviously regulation is part of that, but not the only part. And all of those present significant challenges to not only us as regulators, but particularly also to you as the market participants. I could speak for hours about the transitions and challenges that are currently on the list of issues that we are discussing, but I decided to concentrate today, also in light of the agenda of the conference and the topics that you are focusing on two important areas that are driving challenging transitions. First of all, sustainable finance, and secondly, benchmarks. Thirdly, I will briefly touch on a couple of other key challenges that are occupying the EU securities markets and us at ESMA, certainly this year and for the years to come, I suspect. But let me begin with sustainable finance, which is high on the regulatory agenda as well as the wider global political agenda. The transition to a low-carbon, more resource-efficient and sustainable economy can only be achieved by building a financial system that supports the financing of sustainable growth. Internationally, important steps have been taken with the 2016 Paris Agreement on climate change and the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To achieve the ambitious targets set for the EU as agreed in Paris, which includes a 40% reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions, ESMA must fill, luckily not ESMA, Europe must fill an investment gap that the European Commission has estimated as about 180 billion euros per year. A transition to greener growth is about making an investment in our future, and 180 billion per year is a substantial investment indeed. To be able to achieve this, we need to fundamentally review how the EU capital markets can support investment in sustainable growth. To kickstart this tremendous transition, the Commission has initiated the ambitious action plan on financing sustainable growth for the Union, which you will all be very well aware of, I'm sure, and might have well been discussed earlier here at the conference. The plan intends to clarify fiduciary duties and to increase the transparency for both risks and investment opportunities related to sustainability. In May 2018, the Commission further detailed how all of this should be achieved. The package on sustainable finance includes proposal, amongst other things, on establishing a unified European classification system of sustainable economic activities, the so-called taxonomy, but also to increase transparency on how institutional investors integrate ESG factors into their processes, and the creation of a new category of benchmarks that will help investors compare the carbon footprint of their investments. In addition to all of this, the Commission also asked ESMA for technical advice on integrating sustainability risk and factors in MiFID II and the UCITS and AIFMD directives. Following a public consultation, we submitted the advice on this for possible amendments to relevant rules to the Commission on the 30th of April. Just a very brief insight into what we put into that advice. First of all, starting with investment funds, we recommended that changes to the UCITS and AIFMD Level 2 legislation in respect of organizational requirements, operating conditions, and risk management. For example, on organizational requirements, we recommended amending relevant requirements to ask all UCITS managers and AIFMs to consider sustainability risks in their internal processes, systems, and controls, devote sufficient resources to the integration of sustainability risks, and ensure that senior management is responsible for the integration of those sustainability risks. In relation to operating conditions, we recommended that fund managers consider sustainability risks in their due diligence processes. In addition to due diligence requirements, we also recommended that fund managers consider conflicts of interest that might arise in relation to the integration of such sustainability risks. Finally, regarding risk management, we propose to include sustainability risks in the list of the material risks that need to be managed by UCITS, management companies, and AIFMs. Turning to the investment firm side, our technical advice on MiFID II covers investment firms' general operational and organizational requirements, risk management, and again, conflict of interest policies. It also covers product governance, and in addition to the advice that we gave, we are actually also now in the process of updating the guidelines on product governance and suitability, and will obviously take the sustainability aspect into account as we do so. As you may be aware, in March this year, European co-legislators also agreed on a new regulation on ESG disclosures. This regulation sets out ESG disclosure requirements for a broad range of financial market participants and financial products. The aim of this regulation is to strengthen disclosures to end investors. Under the disclosure regulation, we at ESMA, but also jointly with our EBA and EIOPA colleagues, are asked to deliver a number of technical standards relating, amongst others, to public disclosure of so-called principal adverse impacts of investment decisions on sustainability factors, product-specific disclosure requirements, showing how products fulfill environmental and social characteristics or meet sustainability investment objectives, and also how to market sustainable investments. We will coordinate this work closely with the other ESAs to produce the requested draft technical standards. And although the timeline is quite tight with just 12 months to the end of the process where we have to provide those technical standards, we expect to do so and hope to finalize that in the course of next year. Coming back to the theme of my speech today, transitions and challenges. As you can see, there are big transition and substantial challenges ahead in the area of sustainability. However, I strongly believe all these different aspects ultimately will drive greater transparency to and assistance and clarity for the end investor on how to invest in a way that supports sustainability. It will be down to all of us, market participants and regulators alike, to ensure that we help the EU capital markets to meet the sustainable finance challenge and grasp the opportunity that this transition presents. Let me now move on to the second topic of benchmarks. I will first briefly talk about the low carbon benchmarks, which also fit in with the sustainability agenda that I just talked about, and then speak a bit more generally about the transition to new benchmarks. Benchmarks play an extremely important role guiding investors, pricing investment products, and in directing investment flows. The creation of new benchmarks that consider the carbon footprint of underlying assets will certainly help in reassuring investors looking to invest into sustainable finance products. As mentioned earlier, under the Commission Action Plan on Financing Sustainable Growth, an important agreement was reached by EU co-legislators on low carbon benchmarks in February. The agreement creates two new categories or labels of low carbon benchmarks. One being the EU Climate Transition Benchmark, which brings the resulting benchmark portfolio on a decarbonization trajectory. And the second one being the EU Paris Aligned Benchmark, which basically links back to the Paris Climate Agreement goal to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. For these two new benchmarks, the Commission has mandated an industry-led expert group to define certain requirements, such as the methodology, weighting methods of the underlying assets, and the criteria for the choice of the underlying assets. In addition, each benchmark will have to provide an explanation of how the methodology reflects ESG factors. This will facilitate investors' choices, limit greenwashing, as well as hopefully assist in the proliferation of these new green benchmarks. However, following the agreement of the low carbon benchmark legislative package, the ESG disclosures will not be limited to these two new benchmark categories. All benchmark within their benchmark statement should disclose whether they pursue ESG objectives. And as such, we would expect to see, as of the 31st December of 21, all benchmarks except for interest rate and currency benchmarks, including such information on the degree of alignment with the Paris Agreement in their benchmark statements. A wide variety of indices is currently grouped together as low carbon indices. Those low carbon indices are used as underlying benchmarks for investment portfolios and products that are sold across borders. Many low carbon indices are also used as performance measures for investment portfolios with a carbon emission related strategy. In addition, portfolio and asset managers often hedge their carbon exposure risks by using such benchmarks. There are already quite a few low carbon benchmarks around. However, there are very much divergent approaches to benchmark methodologies, and that results in a certain degree of fragmentation and misalignment. Introducing a clear distinction between EU climate transition and EU Paris-aligned benchmarks and developing minimum standards on each of them will contribute to more consistency. In addition, having a common EU framework for these low-carbon indices will allow asset managers and other users, when looking at benchmarks produced in other member states, to be sure that these benchmarks use the same standards and approaches. Let me now move on to benchmarks more broadly. The ESG angle aside, as I mentioned earlier, benchmarks play an extremely important role in financial markets, and I'm sure for your businesses as much as for anyone else. Following the manipulation of the important benchmarks in the past, the EU's benchmark regulation therefore regulates indices used as benchmarks in financial instruments and financial contracts, as well as indices measuring the performance of investment funds. All benchmarks used in the EU and their administrators are by the end of 2020 at the latest required to fully comply with the new benchmark regulation. However, as part of the political agreement on low carbon benchmarks, a longer transition period of an additional 2 years has been granted to benchmarks provided from outside the Union and for those benchmarks that are classified as critical in the EU. This decision on extending the transition period for critical benchmarks is, in our view, extremely important, as a discontinuation of such benchmarks could impact market fragmentation, financial stability, but not only that, also consumers and households and businesses that are using these benchmarks on a daily basis, whether it's your mortgage or other financial products. The transitional period introduced will ensure the availability of benchmark regulation compliant critical benchmarks by the end of the new transition period and anticipate any potential delay that there might be in their implementation. The most important euro-denominated interest rate benchmarks are EONIA and Euribor. Both EONIA and Euribor are classified as critical benchmarks as they are widely used both in cash and derivative products, representing underlying gross notional values exceeding 150 trillion euros. EONIA is widely used in derivatives with maturity dates that can go out for even beyond 30 years, and it's also used to a lesser extent in cash products and instruments. However, EONIA in its current form will not become benchmark regulation compliant given the lack of underlying transaction and a high concentration of volumes on the hands of very few contributors. Therefore, unless its methodology is improved, EONIA can no longer be used in new contracts as of the new end of the transition period, so meaning as of the 1st of January 2022. Euribor, in contrast, could become benchmark regulation compliant by moving to the Euribor hybrid methodology. This new methodology would strengthen Euribor by bringing in transaction data, and it's currently under implementation with a plan to actually finalize this implementation in the near future, and certainly looking at further developments in the second half of this year. Moreover, the administrator of Euribor has also applied for authorization from the Belgian Financial Services and Markets Authority recently. An industry-led working group with the task of identifying and recommending alternative euro risk-free rates is currently looking into alternatives for both EONIA and Euribor. This group is also tasked to work on a market adoption plan to ensure a smooth transition to these alternative euro risk-free rates by all market participants. Over the last year, during the preparation phase, this working group on euro risk-free rates has worked hard in finding and ultimately recommending the replacement of EONIA with ESTER. ESTER, with a wonderful little euro sign, as you will have seen, is the new euro short-term rate and will be published by the ECB starting this October. The group is also working on the transition path to move from EONIA to ESTER, and on an ESTER-based term structure that could potentially function as a robust and resilient fallback for Euribor. The next phase of the working group is to ensure that these recommendations will be adopted by all market participants. And here the group is looking mainly into legal, financial accounting and risk management implications and how to remove the potential barriers that are there for the adoption of these new rates. ESMA is directly involved in the working group on euro risk-free rates and cooperates closely in this with the ECB and the Commission, as well as the FSMA, the Belgian regulator that is currently responsible for the day-to-day supervision of Euribor, EONIA and ESTER. I should note here that in a few years' time, ESMA itself will become the direct supervisor of critical benchmarks, as well as third country benchmarks in the European Union, and thus we will play an even more important role in this topic. Critical benchmarks and their transition into benchmark regulation compliance are a challenge for all of you as users of these essential providers, as well as for us as regulators and supervisors. Let me now finally move on to the third section of my speech today. And as promised earlier, I wanted to use the opportunity of being here with you to touch very briefly on a couple of other key challenges that are occupying the European securities markets and us at ESMA this year and beyond. And maybe not so surprising, the first topic on this list is Brexit. It's difficult these days to talk about the UK leaving the EU, to not talk about the UK leaving the EU in one way or another. However, I'm clearly not going to want to comment on the political process, but rather focus on the practical issues we need to address to guarantee an orderly exit in terms of the financial markets. It is important to be well prepared when the biggest capital market leaves the EU's single market. Also, given London's many and close interlinkages to the EU financial markets, which will continue, obviously, after the exit, the UK will not just become a normal third country. A lot of preparations have been done and are ongoing on both sides of the channel and by both the public and the private sector. As ESMA, we've early on identified risks to our supervisory convergence objectives, particularly in the context of UK firms moving their operations to and creating new entities within the EU27. In the summer of 2017, we clarified that what is expected from different market players in terms of, for example, substance and governance arrangements when setting up in the EU27. To ensure a true and fair level playing field across the EU, we decided that further supervisory convergence work was required and therefore set up the so-called Supervisory Coordination Network. This is a forum that allows senior authorization and supervision experts from the national competent authorities to discuss cases that they are managing involving UK entities looking for authorization in the EU27. We are aware of the uncertainty which Brexit brings to the market and to all of you. There are immediate consequences in case of a no-deal Brexit scenario, and we've put a lot of effort into preparing for this scenario. One key consequence that worried many parts of the market was the fact that delegation of investment and risk management activities to UK entities would not be permitted unless there are cooperation agreements in place between the national supervisors and the UK authorities. This is why we recently announced that ESMA and European securities regulators have agreed MOUs with the UK FCA. These MOUs would only take effect, of course, in the event of a no-deal Brexit scenario. The MOUs we put in place are essential so that regulators may exchange supervisory information and can guarantee investor protection, orderly markets, and stability. Given the potential significant impact on the current business models of the industry, should there be no transitional arrangements agreed, the MOUs have therefore been our absolute priority. Another key area of concern was the access of EU counterparties and market participants to UK post-trade infrastructure in the case of a no-deal Brexit. Here, ESMA also took action in close alignment with the Commission, which issued temporary equivalence decisions to ensure that UK CCPs and the UK CSD could be recognised and that the necessary MOUs with the Bank of England are in place. Even with these key issues having been tackled, I would like to remind everybody that sound contingency planning needs to remain high on all of our agendas. Given the significant levels of uncertainty remaining around the exact shape, timing and impact of Brexit, it is important to remain diligent and to best manage the transition to a post-Brexit environment. Coming back to my theme of transitions and challenges, I'm sure you agree that the topic of Brexit will continue to preoccupy us and impact on all of us for the years to come. The second subject, which you can hardly escape these days when you talk about Europe's securities markets, is MiFID II. Even if MiFID II has been in place for nearly a year and a half now, it is only gradually that we can judge its impact on the markets. Overall, regulators and ESMA saw a smoother than expected transition to the new regime. On the market side, the reporting, following a period of some teething problems for equity and many non-equity instruments, is now functioning reasonably well, with an unprecedented amount of data being available to regulators and the public. I believe this shows, together with the post-trading data on derivatives, the data on investment funds, and soon to come also the securities financing transactions, that we are starting to harvest the first fruits of all this new data collection. And that is both at national and EU level for our risk monitoring, but also for our supervision, market surveillance, or other market abuse analysis. ESMA has conducted its first analysis on the fund industry and the derivatives markets based on this data, which certainly a decade ago would have been purely impossible because the data was not available. However, we are also conscious that all this reporting has placed a heavy burden on you in the industry. It will be important to ensure that we build on the lessons learned from the implementation of the various reporting regimes and aim to find synergies and common standards that make reporting regimes smoother. We also need to continue our efforts on data standardization, and where we can, do that at a global level to drive forward data completeness and quality to the benefit of all data users. The whole topic of MiFID II and MiFID data is another area where we are still in the transition period, which places many challenges on all of us, but it also offers opportunities to further increase transparency and achieve better results in terms of investor protection and orderly markets across the Union. To conclude, today I've focused on the transition and challenges for European securities markets stemming from sustainable finance and benchmarks, but also from Brexit and MiFID II. I've emphasized the importance of markets adapting to the challenges that these changing circumstances present, and hopefully we can also seize on these transition and changes as opportunities to further strengthen the European capital market. Looking at the next panel discussion, which is going to follow, which will focus on the 10 years after the financial crisis, let me end by saying that I'm pleased to see the tremendous transition that the EU financial markets have already accomplished, and I'm looking forward to experience the next chapter. Thank you for your attention, and thanks again to ICMA for inviting me to speak here today.